My name is Wright Burnett-Smith, and I'm the General Stage Manager for Michael Jackson 1 by Cirque du Soleil.
And how long have you been on this role?
For this role, I've been in this position almost 2 years.
Fantastic. And how long has your career in stage management been?
I started in stage management, probably 16 years ago.
Great. And tell me a little bit about your journey into stage management, starting with why stage management, and then perhaps your education into the industry.
Yeah. So growing up, I really always loved theater, and I was really into aeronautics too. So I got to high school, and I couldn't decide if I wanted to be an actor or a pilot. So I applied for both schools.
Yeah.
I got into a really great theater school, and I got into a really phenomenal aeronautics school too. And I decided to pick theater because I thought I'd make more money. I was 18. So clearly actors don't make as much as pilots, but I was young. So I went to school to be an actor, and I did 2 years, and I didn't really enjoy it. It didn't resonate with me. And so between my sophomore and junior year of college, my second and third year, I just decided to work for a company in Dallas called Dallas Summer Musicals, which is a Broadway roadhouse. And they present like 7 or 8 national touring Broadway musicals in the summer. And I worked there as a PA. And I just spent all this time figuring out where I might fit in better in theater. And so I shadowed rigging, front of house, company management, carpentry, wardrobe, and then I did stage management. And I realized that stage management was like being an actor and a pilot all at the same time. So I really got into that. So I went back to school and I studied at the Boston Conservatory in Boston. And I went back and I said, I still want to continue with the acting classes. I still want to have the mind of an actor, but be adaptable to be in stage management. So I worked my last 2 years because at the conservatory, they don't have a stage management program. And so I just kind of did jobs here and there with the university to hone my skills. And it was really kind of self-taught.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so it's funny that you say about being a pilot and stage management analogy, because many other people in my career have compared air traffic control to stage management, and they're very similar, or the decisions that pilots need to make under pressure are similar to especially on the scale that you work now in a circus thing, because if you in circus environment, because if you do make mistakes or if you're making the wrong decisions, people can be hurt, right? So what, from your self-education within that realm, what was your first job in the industry and how did you get that as a paid stage manager? As a paid stage manager.
So my first job was with a regional company in Boston called Speakeasy Stage Company, and they had partnered with Boston Theater Works to present a play called Take Me Out. And it was the year that the Boston Red Sox had broken their losing streak and won the World Series. So Boston and baseball were huge. So I got that job because in school I had stage managed 2 shows with this director, and he really liked me, and he was the artistic director of Speakeasy Stage, so he brought me on as an entry-level stage management position, and I got my equity card through that job, and the show ended up extending, so it was great. I got to do a 3 or 4 month regional theater run, which was awesome.
And so your work naturally flowed on from there. Was there any difficulties about getting work after that? And then tell me a little bit about your trajectory into Vegas for where you are now.
So after that, I ended up deciding, I had gotten married, and we decided to move to Vegas instead of New York. We had friends that had moved at that. There was kind of the Broadway wave, so everyone from the East Coast was heading out west, and we had a friend who was working out here on We Will Rock You. And we had visited and really loved it. And I knew if I was in New York, I was going to PA for years and years and years and years and not make any money and have a really hard time getting my foot in the door. So we ended up coming out here, and so I went to grad school. I started at UNLV, and they put me my first semester, because I wasn't really too keen on going to grad school. They put me in their internship program, which was at Celine Dion's A New Day at the Coliseum. So I started there. And that was my first semester of graduate school. And then from there, they said, well, we really like you. It's a Franco Dragone show. They're looking for somebody at Rêve at Wynn. and would you be interested in interviewing? So I interviewed and got it, and so I left my internship early. I dropped out of grad school, and then so worked from there. And then since I've had that job, I've never had a day of unemployment in stage management, and so it's been now 14 years.
That's a credit to you. Your ability then.
Or luck, pure luck.
Perhaps. I mean, you're in a great place for regular work, despite the volatility of shows opening and closing.
Yes.
What do you feel that, in hindsight, people saw in you, even though you were young, to put faith in hiring you? What were the skill sets, do you think, that are important as you're entering the industry that people are looking for?
The thing, when I first got hired in my very first PA job in professional theater, through when I got hired at Speakeasy Stage Company or even at Rêve, it was just they saw in me a desire to learn and really open to wanting to know how things were done, and no pretending that I knew what I was doing or that I could do it well. I just had there was a hunger for wanting to learn how to be better at it, and I think I was really open and also not intense, and people kind of responded to that. And I know that the reason I got my very first job in theater was because when I was in the interview, they said, well, we'll take you on stage. And I grew up in Dallas. So when I interviewed there, that's the theater I had grown up seeing every show in before I went to college. And when I stood on the stage, I guess I took a breath, like an awe, like wow, kind of breath. And she said that was the moment that she decided to hire me, because there was an appreciation and a gratitude and a openness.
Do you think that there's a certain type of people that are attracted to stage management, and what are those innate abilities or those innate personality traits that certain type of people gravitate towards that role?
I think a lot of people do it for organization or the logic part of it, the puzzle and figuring out how all these moving pieces can work together. They're big problem solvers. They are good with delayed gratification. They can work for months and months and months for one thing to work out and be fulfilled by that. I think people also get into it for an artistic outlet. I originally wanted to be an actor because I wanted that kind of creative role, but I didn't feel fulfilled by performing, but I felt very fulfilled by helping someone else perform. I think also a lot of people who innately want to be teachers or who have a desire to share their knowledge tend to move into stage management, because it's very much what we do. Yes, we do the logic part and the scheduling and the logistics of having the show run nightly, but we also, a lot of times, are the first wave of teaching the show to somebody and kind of having them explore it artistically on their own side and creating an environment to do that.
It's interesting that you say about the creative element, and would you agree, first of all, that some stage managers can wear both hats of logical and creative, and others are maybe more on the logical, practical side, as a first question? And then second question is like, how important or explain for us how creativity fits into a stage management role?
Yeah, I think there's always that debate of people say you're either technical friendly or artistic friendly. I do think people can have both and can wear both hats. I mean, people in general are all different, and so I think in stage management you're going to have the same thing. Some are much more technical based, some are much more artistic based, and there are people who can do both. I really feel, especially in my current role, that I act as a translator. Necessarily, like, technical and artistic don't speak the same language, so I think that's where I kind of fit, is in the middle, because I do have a conservatory acting training background, but then I also have worked on really, really technically advanced shows and understand the systems and the processes they have to use, so it can be useful. And then what was the second question again? Creative?
How does creativity play into your day-to-day role as a stage manager?
Creativity is huge here. For me, we have to have the show run nightly, but depending on who's in and out, we have to make changes. We have to be able to say, okay, instead of this entrance and exit being here, we need to change it. Or there's an aspect of the story that we can't tell, whether it's for an artistic or a technical reason, and we have to come up with an alternative artistic scene to kind of lead us through skipping an act, or and that you have to be creative and you have to think of the overall story and represent the director's vision. And if you're lucky enough to have a resident director or an artistic director working on the show, hopefully they're around to be able to help with that. But in stage management, especially on smaller projects, or if they're out on vacation, you have to do that role. But in addition, we're the first wave of teaching the show to new artists. So if you have a new actor or a new artist who comes in, while you may not be going through all the acting beats, and this is your tactic and your motivation and all of the nitty-gritty of being an actor, you are teaching them the basic through line and guiding them through that so that they explore it on their own while representing the vision of the director. So it's you have to protect it.
That's interesting. Moving a little bit to back to the educational realm for stage management, given the fact that you spoke about people being a translator between technical and creative or artistic, there's a lot of talk in the interviews that I've done about the people skills required to be a stage manager and how important that is. A lot of institutions don't put a lot of weight on that, and given the fact that we're looking to not only build a course that is for stage management, but also from international, because when you throw it into international realm, you're also dealing with major cultural differences and things like that, which you already experience because you're working with an international team here. But moving yourself and your own culture shock and things like that. Yeah. Do you think that people management or people skills, or however we want to talk about that, should be included in a curriculum, and how? What sort of training do you think would, you may not be able to answer this, but what sort of training do you think would help stage managers be aware that that's such a big part of their job? Yeah,
it's challenging because a lot of times it'll be referred to as hard and soft skills, and I think hopefully the people are getting away from those terms, because to say hard and soft, it implies that one's more important than the other. Whereas, especially in stage management, being able to work with people is the biggest aspect of your success. Because I think finding someone who can do technical duties, the actual things necessitated to just operate the show, call the show, run to backstage tracks, run rehearsal, anyone can really be trained with adequate time to do those things. What takes somebody apart, whether they excel at it, is how good they are with people. And in terms of teaching it for how you learn it, I think a lot of it comes from just innately who you are as a person, how you grew up. But I think it's really teaching active listening. I think there's also a lot of value placed in teaching people how to do open-ended questions instead of offering advice or asking a question that results in a yes or a no, letting them phrase how they want to answer the question. So if you know an artist is, for example, late, you wouldn't say just a simple, what happened today that prevented you from being here on time? What can you do in the future that it will help you be here? What support do you need to make that, to make the commitment of being here? I think sometimes we just want to, as stage managers, we want to fix, because that's what we do innately. But when it comes to the people stuff, maybe there just needs to be a lot of emphasis in how people teach themselves and helping guide people making their own decisions rather than you imparting something on them. That's really valuable advice, and structuring that to sort of teach that in a curriculum is, for me, I think is pretty important, and it's becoming quite a thread with the people that we speak to. Tell me about, on a practical level, I know Cirque have their proprietary software or anything, but on a personal level with your technology and devices, as you've been in the industry for quite a considerable number of years, this has changed and developed and things like that. So do you have any apps or communication devices or software that is your go-to, aside from what you do to build the lineup, but that is your go-to stuff for your day-to-day functions as a stage manager? Yeah. Or in your life as well, organisation? No, I mean, Microsoft is what I feel like can do most everything. I think there's it's really about adaptability. I don't necessarily know if there's an app or a program that I prefer to use. It's more keeping the skill set and the mindset of there's going to be something great out there, and knowing that what might work for this job may not work for the next. And so and I'm somewhat old school in many ways, so I still do everything in pencil and have my ruler and all of that. But I also know when I need to document, then you have to do it in a different format. So it's made me think of things. I think there's lots of great apps and lots of things to do, but I think it's really honing in on what's best for you, what provides you support. Because I think sometimes just learning a new thing, the time invested in it may not give you the result you need.
That's a good point, because often, because you're so busy and you're executing every day on a day-to-day basis, you don't have the time to bring something on board and implement it. And a lot of resistance for any major regime change in terms of software or administration when you're trying to actively run a show becomes quite a challenge. Would you agree?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Because I think you have also the generational changes between who you work with is going to change how they like to do things. And for instance, we switched at one point from an actual sign-in sheet to an electronic sign-in, and that was a challenge for some people because that's not part of their routine was taking the pencil or pen to the sign-in sheet every day. Whereas and then some thought it was a way that they were going to be caught by being late, and it's just a matter of this is faster and more efficient for us.
Yeah.
We don't have to spend as much time on it. So technology a lot of times can get in the way. I think just in life, technology can get in the way. We're so in tune of representing ourselves in a social media way that we don't remember how to represent ourselves in real life. And I think it can be the same thing with our work. We have to be very careful without relying on technology too much, because so much of what we do is about face-to-face and about building trust and creating a space in which people can make mistakes or try things that may not work without any judgment. And if you're staring at a screen and you're not looking at them, it can get in the way.
And not to use technology for the sake of using technology.
Yeah.
Just because it's there and it's available doesn't make necessarily everything more efficient.
Yeah.
If there's potential for technical problems, etc., like you said, an electronic sign-in is an active time saver for the team, so that's an implementation. But
and one of the things that comes about, a lot of shows now are switching to time code, and it's so easy to just go, okay, I'm going to call off the time code, but then you're staring at a clock instead of the stage.
Yeah.
And things can get away from you. And so I think there's times where the technology needs to almost enhance your ability to look up from whatever you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And if it doesn't, and you're spending more time working with the technology than the actual project, it's not the right thing for you.
We had, it was implemented after I left, but I was working it up since I was working on the House of Dancing Water, but we had digital displays for our lineup because our building was so large, and my stage managers rarely got a break, and that 10 minutes, 15 minutes of running around the building and posting lineups to just be able to press send, and there was a huge time saver. So also we now put the schedule up there and other things. So there are uses for it when it becomes an efficient.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you seen any of the stage management software out there, and do you have any opinions on any of those?
No, to be honest, I work for a company that has all of their own intellectual property regarding management, so I'm not really too familiar with outside stuff.
Can you name any one or two key evolution points in your career where you really felt you had a growth in your capability as a stage manager, and what were they?
First was when I was doing an internship with Boston Ballet when I was in college. They afforded me the opportunity of being able to call the second act of Nutcracker, which was amazing, and that's not something as an intern you get to do in many places, is actually call a show. And I studied and studied and studied and studied. And when we got to the end, I did it great the first performance, and then the second one I was like, okay, I've got this. I've worked, I've done this, okay, it went well. And then the second one, I was flicking wrong switches and had my hand slapped by the VSM a couple times, and I got pulled from calling it ever again. And it was a really important lesson for me that there is no end to the process, that the process is always ongoing. And as hard as I studied, the one time I did it right has no indication, because the last time you do something is your reputation. So even though I did it great once, I left with a reputation of not being able to do it as well. So that was really important to me, because then the next opportunity that I had to call was a much larger show with far more advanced technical systems, and I made sure that every time I called, I did some type of mental prep before. So that was a really good learning curve for me. And then another kind of interesting one was figuring out how to let the job go. And it happened a couple of years later, and it was Thanksgiving, which was, a huge holiday in Vegas for tourists. And I was calling a show, and we had major technical problems, and we had to cancel. And we had to cancel the second show that night. And even though I think I did everything really, really well, it really stayed with me that maybe I could have done something more to prevent it from happening. I'm like, no. Like, years down the line, no, I can't. There's nothing else I could have done. But it stayed with me a really long time. That, what could you have done? And now it really taught me, you've got to let it go. That show ends, and that show ends. And you have to kind of move on.
Yeah.
And then work-life balance. It's great to love your work. It's important to have other things you're passionate about too.
Very, very common thread in stage managers.
Yes.
And it's only through a seasoned stage manager that you start to. And to be fair, when you're younger, when you're younger, you have a lot of energy and you're trying to get into the industry and you're trying to make a reputation. But once you're in, it's really then important to pull the reins back and create that balance, because then you start to do a disservice to yourself and your work when you're not got any perspective.
Yeah, and burnout is so easy.
Correct.
Burnout is really easy.
It's very easy to just keep working because the job's never done, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Can you tell me what advice or recommendation for somebody who'd be trying to become grow in a show caller capacity? From your experience, you've gone from ballet, etc., up to quite high-end calling, given the fact that Cirque has a lot of automation and there's a lot of acrobatics, which is layers and layers of complexity, as opposed to calling lighting cues. So, do you have any advice on how to improve as a caller?
I think one of the things that whenever I teach someone to call a show, that I really push on them is you have to know the show from multiple angles, and not just visually. We do things where I'll play just the music, and they have to call it just off the music. And then we'll mute the music, and they can only watch the visual, and they have to be able to call it off the visual. And it's just kind of in tuning yourself to all the different senses and the ways that you can anticipate. And then it's the monotony of it. I keep saying, while you may do it great once, you have to do it great possibly thousands of times. And the more and more you do it, the less you see of what's going right, and the more you see of what's going wrong or what's different. So then it's really easy to give lighting focus notes, because if you watch it every night, suddenly something's out of focus, you go, oh, okay, that's out of focus, because it looked different, jumped out at you. And so it's really pushing that it's monotonous work, but before you sit down to call a show, in my opinion, you should have spent at least 100, 200 hours on it, just over and over and over and over. And every show call that I've been really successful in, it's just been about preparation. And just doing it so much that the nerves aspect of it, I can concentrate on it the first time because I know the material. It's just about controlling my nerves. If you're not solid on the material, and you need to memorize your book, you should never call a show unless you don't have to look at your book.
Well, that's a big call.
Yeah, it's a big one. And it's hard, and especially on some of the smaller things where you don't have as much chance of injuring people. But if you're doing anything with artists that are flying, or traps, or anything where you're creating a hazard to people on stage, you should never look at your book during that time. So then it's also on shows saying, okay, for instance, on our current show, I'll say these 5 acts, we're not even going to look at you calling until you can do it from memory. And then we'll start looking at you calling the show, because I think it's just so important.
Yeah.
I'm a little OCD when it comes to calling.
No, I think it's it's good advice, and that's what we're looking for when I'm talking to people like you. Do you rehearse or teach in the show that we worked on? There wasn't even just the calling capacity and what the cues were and being able to visually do it, but there was a lot of look at this screen for this,
yes.
press this button, do this,
yeah.
cue light, blah, blah, blah. Is that the same case here? And do you get your show callers to rehearse that as a layer of learning?
Absolutely. Foot pedals can be your downfall.
Foot pedals?
Yeah, just to turn the mic on and off with a foot pedal.
You have a foot pedal with you?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it's really nice. Because then, especially with your hands are free and then the crew doesn't hear you breathe all the time, which is really awkward. Yeah, so much of what we do is it's almost like, going back to a pilot reference, how they have flight simulators, you have to kind of create the same thing. So even if it's just shoe boxes with paper on them that mimic your cue lights or your comm station or your televisions, and when we train to call, we do a lot of things of you need to point at what you're looking at to show me that you know what you're doing. Mm-hmm. So it can feel really silly to have shoe boxes around you and paper diagrams with cue lights and all, and then pointing at inanimate objects. But it brings about confidence, not only in me, the person training, but also if I was learning, confidence that I know what I'm supposed to be doing and that I have been taught correctly, or that I have prepared myself correctly if I was creating the call.
How long is the show calling training generally? Because I'm sure it probably varies from caller to caller, but how long generally does it take to put somebody into the show that you're currently working on? And what are you as the GSM looking to see before you put them in the show?
Yeah, I would say the average training is probably 3 to 4 months, and what we're looking at is layered. One, can they call a clean show from a multitude of different mindsets? That they are properly taught all the contingencies, that we've rehearsed and they have demonstrated that they are able to think on their feet. And for me, I don't ever look for they do it exactly like me. Everyone kind of has their own vibe. It's more about, do you know what the images are supposed to look like? What you're calling, this light cue is supposed to look like this. So even if you call it slightly different for me, is the image correct? That's what we're concentrating on. But then also with the contingencies is knowing that they aren't worried. They're not scared themselves. It's almost I'm looking for confidence and presence. That sometimes when you say, okay, we're going to rehearse this scenario, and then they bomb it, and then you give them something 3 times harder, but you don't tell them what it is, and they just knock it out of the ballpark, and it's fantastic. And it's because they're too nervous about perfectionism. So it's almost like breaking somebody down to then have them rebuilt. And so I think mostly I have found when you teach someone to call, they can tell you when they're ready, and you had already decided for yourself that they're ready before they had said they were ready.
Yeah, because they're so, most of the time, that they're scared
shitless
to do it. So they're like, I'm not ready. You think I'm ready?
And I've been there before. Are you sure I'm ready to do this?
It's interesting because you and Mary teach the contingencies before you put them into the show. The way that we used to do it, and maybe it's because of how it took me 3 to 4 months for people to learn the show call at the House of Dancing Water. So I would not go through the contingencies until after that. So I would put them in the show and I would sit behind them for 2 weeks, and they would call the show. And the minute something would go wrong, I would step in, I would deal with it. Then after 2 weeks, we'd go into the contingencies and we'd go through what I call the fear phase, where they like go back there and they suddenly realise what they're calling and what can go wrong, because there was just so many variables that it was too much information when they were trying to learn the core thing. So it's really interesting to see, because I haven't seen this show yet, but I can see with Love how teaching the contingencies, because there's only probably so many that are the major ones to learn, whereas there's a lot more volatility in the show that we worked on, so that you never, even if I could teach you the 11 different prompt scripts and the 22 different show changer things, somebody could get on stage and do something completely different, and then it's all rules out the window. How do we deal with that information? Do you think working under pressure as a caller is something that is achieved by continually throwing yourself out there? Is there something that's innate Can it be learned?
I think it can be learned, but what can't be learned is I feel when people get stressed, they either relax or they get tense. And so in interviews, that's a big thing we do, is we try to identify whether this is somebody who relaxes in distress or if it's somebody who tenses up. And if they tense up, we're not hiring them. And that as long as they'll relax in distress, you know that they're not going to make a rash decision. Because where I think callers can really get into trouble is feeling like I can't stop the show and I have to do this. Or this is where the cue is called and I need to call it now. And they take risks that they shouldn't. Whereas someone who relaxes into it can then kind of sit back and slow time and think things through differently. So I think that aspect can't be taught. But somebody who relaxes into it may be way too relaxed and not have the, hey, we really need you to drive this. And that aspect of it can be taught.
Yeah.
As saying, you're in charge. In that moment, it's no longer a democracy, it's a dictatorship, and you decide what you're doing because you can't have multiple input and get thoughts and your people's others' feelings, and you take that feedback and you say, this is what we're doing, and that can be taught.
Yeah. You have to at some point lead the team or it's the ship's going down.
Yeah, exactly. Very quickly.
Exactly. Which was a good segue to my very next question. In terms of hiring stage managers, what are you looking for? What do you do when you're stress testing the interview? Because that sounds scary. I don't want to be in an interview with you. And how do you read that? And what, not only in terms of skill sets, but what are you looking to add to the team when you bring somebody in?
Well, when we bring someone in, it always is about the current team and how we're made up. And knowing that it's important that everyone feels connected to someone on the stage management team in the building, crew and cast. Everyone has to have their ally. And I know that I may not be that person for some people, so it's my job to ensure that I hire people that are. So we take a stock of who we have and where we're lacking. So if we are, someone's really methodical and real attention to detail, and then you have somebody who is really outgoing, then that's a good pairing. They work really well together, they bring out the best in each other. But if you have two people that are both methodical or two people who are both really high energy or fun, and sometimes you're missing that. So it's looking at personality types and going, okay, we already know going in that we're looking for this. And then in the interviews, it's just really important to get a sense of who they are. Because for me, so much of this job is that I spend almost more time with the team than I do with my own family. And so it's important that we like each other. And it's important that we enjoy being together. And so a lot of the interview, skill set wise, we're going to have a really good indication from their resume. The interview for me is more about, do you gel? And being able to test people for high stress. We do rapid fire questions, but they're pretty silly. They're not, what would you do in this case? It's things like, what did you listen to on the way here? Who would play you in a movie? And it's not the answer you're looking at, it's the how long do they take to think about the answer, how quickly do they think on their feet, how much do they take their answer seriously. Those are the indicators to you of how people are going to be. And so we make the stressful aspect of it fun. And it's kind of how we end. And then things like, what type of tacos do you like? And do you do corn or flour tortillas? And it has no implication of their ability to work, but you're just testing how quickly they'll think on their feet. And especially with stage management in a multicultural show, they have to be able to adapt. And so sometimes you might even change your tone in how you ask questions to see how they change, how they give you an answer. And then that lets you know how easy they're going to adapt. If you go from being fun to serious, and they stay fun, and they don't follow you to serious town, then you know, okay, maybe this is also somebody that's too young in their career. Things like that. That's really smart. It takes a long time to learn it. And I think I learned how to interview by being interviewed. Yes. Yeah. And also, did you, when you first started out in terms of hiring a team, trip up a little bit in terms of who you were hiring? Because I know that I did. I was hiring for capability, and that was disastrous for me because they would or would not fit into the team, and or they would come in, get their
qualification of calling one of the biggest shows in the world and then leave because they were there for a different reason than what I needed them to be. And I actually ended up hiring people who are, I'd probably say, less competent, but more amenable to the team that we were.
Yeah. No, I think for me, where it was is that I doubted my gut reaction to people in the beginning, and I'd let my brain make decisions about hiring. And after one or two of those, going, no, your gut was right on them. Like what you initially thought, you talked yourself out of that, and that's exactly who they were. So it was really just trusting that first. I would say within the first minute or two of an interview, you know whether you're going to hire someone or not. And that's why I think when you're interviewing, you think, oh, the interview only lasted 5 minutes, they must not like me. It actually could be, no, they might really like you, and that they just want to go to the bathroom.
they're just not wasting any more time. You're good, let's go.
Yeah.
Have you don't have to talk about any names or specifics, but have you had to let anybody go in your team over your career as a person that's hired people? And what was the factors that made them fail at that role?
I've been fortunate to never work with stage managers that had to be let go. That's not the case with artists or cast. And I think how you approach that is it's saying you're not successful here, and really trying to work with them on being successful in that environment. And if they aren't, it's not you're firing them, or they're awful, or they're a horrible person that should never be hired. It's they couldn't be successful in this environment, and we need to set you up to succeed somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And really taking that approach instead of you're an awful person. Because one, it weighs on you. If you think someone's awful and that they're just a horrible person, then you're a horrible person. So what makes people not successful, I think, is not being open to feedback, first and foremost. And feedback can be both positive and negative, or constructive, I guess you could say, because there are people who are fantastic who are just putting themselves down. So no matter how much positive feedback you give them, they still put themselves down. They're not successful, and they drain the energy of everyone around them. They can't be part of the team. And then there's also people who you give constructive feedback to, and they don't listen to it, and they don't grow from it. I think what it is, it's seeing openness, and that's where people are, I've seen in the past, we've had to let people go, is just basically not their ability to adapt.
What would you say, or how do you work with somebody who's come into the stage management team? They're obviously qualified, they would fit well with the team, but they've never worked with the multicultural cast that you've got. What do you do to prepare them for that, and how do you coach them into working with people that come from all over the world?
I think a big part of it is listen more than you talk. So when there's an issue and you're dealing with something, ask questions that are going to force them to give you their understanding of things. Really going through that you can't be the know-it-all for everyone in the cast. You can't be their ally for everyone in the cast. Because of the multicultural aspect, there may be things related to your gender, how you look, the languages you speak that naturally don't allow connection to form. And if you're part of a really good cohesive team that has varying people on it, you just have to figure out who you are the ally for and really concentrate on those artists or those actors, and not be concerned with the ones that are that don't fit you, because you're never going to tell someone something if they're not willing to listen to you in the first place. So I think that's the big part is just kind of saying, okay, in this culture men will not take instruction from women, or in this culture the more senior member of the team needs to give that feedback, or in this culture age, because you're younger, they're not going to listen to the feedback, so someone older needs to give it. So you just kind of have to teach them those aspects, and then also be open to, this is where we are. If you're doing a show in Europe, this is the culture of Europe. So if you are not from Europe, this is the expectation of how you're going to behave in this culture. Mm-hmm. This isn't acceptable. And also creating really strong boundaries. This is what's acceptable and what's not, and enforcing those boundaries. Mm.
No, that's good advice. And do you find then that the cast are receptive to that behaviour and that approach?
Yes. Yeah. I think when they feel acknowledged, they're always going to have the buy-in. Mm-hmm. It's when people don't feel acknowledged or heard, they're not going to. So if you bulldoze over them, But if you say, I understand that this is how you're feeling, unfortunately in this environment, we can't follow that. This is what we need to do. They tend to follow you.
Yeah. Given in some of the experiences that I've had, when you may be rolling out a contingency mid-show or something like that, and you're working with a group of performers that may or may not have a great command of the English language,
Yeah.
and the ability for you to be not shouting, but giving instructions quickly. Has that happened here, and how do you get your team to manage that? And do you slow things down and make sure you can answer that?
If there is a very large language gap, they typically will have a translator with them as part of their group.
Right.
If there's not, there's challenges where we have to limit how much instruction has to be given to them. So it does take a part of the contingency or what you're doing. If they aren't following you and you get a sense that they're just doing the obligatory, okay, sure, I have no idea what you're saying, but I'm going to nod my head yes, you don't do it.
Yeah.
And that it's very hard, and it was very hard for me to learn that sometimes stopping and skipping is the best option than trying something brand new.
Mm-hmm.
There's levels of some things are worth trying and just figuring it out, and others are not. But also Google Translate is very, very helpful. So whip that out and type a message.
So that is an app you use now.
Yes, I do use Google Translate.
There you go. Technology helps.
But it's awful. No offense to Google.
It's not a great
no,
translator. Especially when you're doing Chinese.
Yes, exactly. Asian languages, not so much.
Suddenly you're like, when you start to look at your strings, you know they've got the translation right. Just a couple more questions from me. Across globally, there's a lot of different titles for stage managers.
Yeah.
Deputy stage manager and general stage manager, and in different realms of the genres of theatre, that can mean many different things. Do you think it would be, in an ideal world, best to sort of look towards a standardisation or understanding of that? And I asked that question in the reason, not because of stage managers knowing what they do or what they don't do, but maybe for people employing stage managers from around the world to work on projects, say in Dubai or Asia or anything like that. And there's this preconception of what that role might mean from management people. So, any comments on that?
Oh, it's really hard. I don't know if it would ever be successful. I think what it comes down to is that in some ways, that's very much what the cover letter's for, is I know my current role, general stage manager, means nothing to anyone that doesn't work for the company I work for. And so it's providing that information in the hiring process. These were the duties of my role. So, because I would view that in New York theater, my role is more like a production stage manager, whereas in my company, production stage manager is only for the production period. So I think also in language, no matter how it's translated, people are going to take different things from it. So I think it's really our job in cover letters to really spell out what the duties were, what you were in charge of.
And their responsibility to dig deep into exactly what they did. Because I think a lot of people can end up on some amazing shows with good titles, but that doesn't mean that they were fantastic at the role or anything like that.
Because exactly, being a production stage manager for a regional theater is different from being a production stage manager for a $150 million production.
Yeah. If a producer in Asia called you up and said, I'm looking for a stage manager to help create a show in China, what would you tell them that they need to look for, or what kind of person, where would they find that person? They know nothing about, theatre, they know nothing about what general stage manager, deputy stage manager, any of those things mean. What sort of list of things would you tell them that they should seek to be successful in hiring the right person?
I think very much when it comes to that, it comes down to word of mouth, and it's really using the networking aspect of the community to make recommendations of here are people and situations or people or companies and position titles that would match what you're looking for. A lot of times right off the bat. People, if they're not used to hiring, will use the online resume services, and that they then send these blanket emails out. Whereas I think it's really trying to find what it is you're looking for. Okay, here's the skill set, and then here's maybe some contacts that would have great options for you. Yeah.
So don't go blind hiring.
No, don't
plug into a network and start to have discussions.
Exactly, because so much of the blind hiring, you don't know the history. Someone may have 30 amazing credits on the resume, and they worked on all 30 of those shows for 2 months because they're extremely difficult. But you may have someone who only has 2 things on their resume, but completely revolutionized that show or that company when they were there for 10 years, 10, 15 years. So it's kind of then expressing that.
That's really good advice. If you were to advise, it's good because you were you're the second person that I've interviewed that hasn't necessarily come into stage management through a traditional academic manner, and I like to see that's a possibility, that there's multiple paths towards this career.
Yeah.
What would you advise somebody who's thinking about stage management to? I'm not saying academic or no academic, but like, what do you think are the key points that they should focus on as they're in their late teens, early 20s to move towards stage management?
It's a good question because I didn't know it existed until my 20s. I think what it is it's about passion. Especially as you grow up, you're following a road and you come to a fork and you go one way, and then you get to another fork and you go another way. And it's just being open to, in this present moment, what is interesting me and what is the best choice for me. Because it could be you could get into some of the best schools or the best programs, but that's not who you are. And so it's just kind of about that gut check and saying, okay, this is what I'm interested in. Because program-wise, I think there's some tremendous programs, and I learned everything from on the job. And I would not have learned that in a classroom because I had just some hard knocks that I got to experience. But I think some people do better with the academic route. So I think it's just when you get to those little forks, you go, which one's the right one for me? Not what is the one I think I need for my career, which is the right one for me. And then it just kind of naturally leads you to where you're supposed to be. Because there's so many people who went into stage management who end up in production management, or who end up as a designer, or who end up becoming crew, or going back to acting, or being musical directors. I mean, there's so many box office managers, there's so many things in theater, you have no idea where you're going to end up. And just because this is where you want to go, doesn't mean it's where you're going to end.
You should be open to going in those forks if that's where it leads you, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
And life takes you in different places too.
Yeah.
You have kids and it complicates things. So.
You kind of got to put the brakes on that fork in the road every couple of years, right?
Exactly.
Keeps you grounded.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Wright.
No,
really
thank you. It's awesome. Yeah.